Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, it's Susan Coffin, and you are listening to Attitude Magazine's ADHD Experts Audio. Today's guest speaker is Dr. Amy Margolis of Columbia University, and she will be talking about a really fascinating topic, a very commonly overlooked and poorly understood learning disability that's called nonverbal learning disability, or NVLD. It's frequently seen in children with ADHD, and it's frequently confused with ADHD. As a result, children with this disorder are oftentimes misdiagnosed and have missed opportunities for intervention early on. NVLD is marked by problems with visual and spatial abilities, along with other difficulties, social interactions, sometimes math skills, and she'll tell us a lot more about the social and academic challenges of NVLD. Other topics that she'll address will be how to distinguish the symptoms of NVLD from those of ADHD, why early diagnosis is important, why clinicians misdiagnose NVLD, signs that parents should look for, how it affects children in the classroom for those of you who might be teachers who are listening in, some strategies that you can use in the classroom and some strategies that parents can use. So it should be a great session. We're looking forward to it, and we're really fortunate to have Amy Margolis with us today. This is not a well-known topic, and we are grateful to her for coming on. She is a neuropsychologist, a Ph.D. at Columbia University Medical Center here in New York in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, where she is leading studies in NVLD and reading disorders with neuroimaging and other research techniques. She is also the director of neuropsychology at the Brooklyn Learning Center, where she trains neuropsychologists to assess and to treat children with learning disabilities and ADHD. So great resources, and for more information, you may contact her. She's generously provided her email address. Amy, I hope that you're prepared for what might follow. Margola, M-A-R-G-O-L-A, at nyspi.columbia.edu. I'll just read one of them, but we'll post all of her email addresses. So thank you again so much for joining us. And I'd also like to just offer a really big thank you to the sponsor of today's webinar, Winston Preparatory School. It's a very innovative day school. It has 3 locations in the New York area: New Jersey, Connecticut, and New York City. It serves children in the 2nd through the 12th grades with learning differences, dyslexia, nonverbal learning disabilities, executive functioning problems, ADHD. Winston Prep is known for individualizing the program to meet each student's needs and for building a very powerful sense of community. So I hope you'll check them out. For more information on their philosophy or to schedule a tour of the school, visit their website. It's www.winstonprep.edu. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Dr. Margolis, and thank you again for being here today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here and speak to everyone. You did a great job of outlining what I'm going to cover. I'll just briefly review again. I'm going to first talk about a definition of nonverbal learning disability, which we abbreviate as NVLD, and talk about the core features of the disorder, and then associated difficulties that children have, and also common comorbidities, which are other disorders that often co-occur with NVLD. And from there, then I'll shift and focus on how do we distinguish NVLD from other disorders, particularly in this case, ADHD, since I know that's of interest to many of your listeners and readers, and has been an important piece of understanding NVLD. And then in the third part of the talk, focus a lot of time on thinking about ways that teachers can help students in class, either by developing curricula that meet their needs or providing accommodations and support. And also parents can use these ideas when working with their children at home, on homework, or trying to give them some support outside of school, and also as advocacy tools. So when they go into school and say, this is what's happening for my child, they may be able to use some of these ideas and suggest things that would benefit their child. So beginning with, what is nonverbal learning disorder? This is a proposed neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by deficits in spatial reasoning that leads to impairment in social or academic functioning. And so a little history lesson. This disorder was first described and written about by Michael Bust in 1967. And at that time, people were very concerned with and interested in verbal learning disabilities. And all that we were writing about in terms of learning disabilities focused on children with language-based verbal learning problems. And so when people became interested in this particular disorder, which is characterized by problems with spatial thinking, In order to distinguish it from verbal learning disabilities, it was named nonverbal learning disability. But unfortunately, that name is not quite accurate. And sometimes when people hear that name, they even think that these children are not verbal, when in fact, these children have good verbal skills, as you'll hear, but problems with spatial thinking. And last, NVLD has had a controversial history. There seems to be quite a lot of debate over whether this is a discrete disorder or not, meaning is it separate from other things? And so like ADHD or Asperger's, autism, and as we go through the talk, you'll hear, as I describe the features of the disorder, why it sounds like other disorders. And also we can think about together, and I'll talk about why it's so important to delineate what NVLD really is. So in the first way of thinking about NVLD, it's important to understand the core feature. So the core feature, or what we scientists call the necessary but not sufficient feature, meaning you have to have this, but having this doesn't mean you have the disorder, is a deficit in spatial capacity, characterized maybe by having trouble with part-whole relationships. So for example, these are children who would shy away from doing jigsaw puzzles or putting together a Lego and following the directions. They might have trouble manipulating objects in space, for example, tying their shoes or using scissors. And they might have trouble learning sequences and patterns, for example, learning routes or schedules. So those are some ways that we think about the deficit in spatial capacity. That's the core feature of NVLD. And then in contrast to this deficit in spatial capacity, these children have average to strong language capacity. They tend to have good vocabulary, to be able to learn verbal information, and to remember details from a story, etc. So when we talk about verbal and spatial abilities, we need to think, how do we assess those? I'm sorry, this is a busy slide, but I wanted to put it all on one slide so you could see them all together. So on the left side, you'll see a column for verbal, and underneath it, it says VIQ or VCI. So those are aspects of IQ tests that are used to measure verbal abilities. So in the old days, before recent versions of the IQ tests, and even with some short forms of the IQ test now, we have something called verbal IQ, or things have shifted in more modern tests to verbal comprehension index. And the subtests that typically compose those scores are vocabulary, in which you say a word to a child and the child has to give you a definition, or where a test that involves more verbal reasoning, where you would ask someone, how are these two things alike? In what way are a shirt and a shoe the same? And the person has to deduce the overarching category that both of these things fit into, for example, in this case, clothing. So those are two subtests that are commonly used, and the scores across those two are averaged to get an idea of somebody's verbal ability. So now, how do we measure their spatial ability? And so spatial ability is typically used to be called performance IQ. And then as we did more and more parsing of the IQ subtests, we shifted to PRI, which stands for Perceptual Reasoning Index, which removed the speeded component and really tried to hone in only on perceptual abilities. And now in the most modern form of the child IQ test, we have split PRI into two parts, fluid reasoning and visual spatial. So visual spatial is best characterized by performance on this block design test. So you'll see in this picture a box with 9 blocks in it, and those blocks are all red, all white, or on some sides half red and half white, and the child is asked to take those blocks and rotate them and move them and put them together so they make a design like the one shown in this picture with the red stripe going from the lower left to the upper right corner. And that's measuring visual spatial ability. And then in the matrix reasoning subtest, which is thought to measure fluid reasoning, children are asked to figure out which of the 5 choices at the bottom of this picture would best complete the pattern and fill in where the question mark is. So in this case, the child would select number 4, as that's the best answer. And people can solve this problem in different ways. Some very spatial or visual people might look at this and intuitively know the answer, whereas people who are more verbal might mediate this task by saying, well, in the upper left box, I see a red orange star in the middle, and in the right box, the orange star is in the front. So moving down to the row below, the orange pentagon's in the front, so I need one where the orange pentagon is in the middle, and then you scan and you choose selection 4. So These are the kinds of tasks that we use to assess verbal and spatial abilities. And what do we know about the verbal spatial discrepancy? So we know, using these verbal IQ and performance IQ scores, that about 25% of people in the normative sample of IQ testing have at least one standard deviation of difference between their verbal and spatial ability across ages, from the youngest to the oldest, who are tested, from really 5 to 90. We see this. And also, we know of those 25% of people who have a discrepancy, about half of them have their discrepancy in the direction of verbal better than spatial, and half in the direction of spatial better than verbal. What else we know is that this discrepancy has a lot of clinical relevance. So, for example, nonverbal learning disability is characterized by children having verbal higher than spatial abilities. And in other disorders, such as autism, language disorder, and reading disorder, we see a spatial greater than verbal capacity. So that is very interesting, that these different neurodevelopmental disorders that children contend with are characterized by these different discrepancies that are also present in the typical population. And last, there's quite a bit of clinical lore about the neural correlates, meaning the brain underpinnings of the discrepancy. And generally, people think this discrepancy, where verbal is greater than spatial, is driven by right hemisphere dysfunction. So in this next slide, I'm going to talk to you about my work using brain imaging to study the verbal spatial discrepancy. And so in this picture here, what you see are the results from our study of how the cortex, the surface of the brain, changes as the verbal spatial discrepancy gets bigger. So what you see in this picture is the relationship between the thickness of the cortex and the size of the discrepancy. So these brain pictures that you see represent the average finding across 160 people, where we correlated. We asked, how much does the brain get thicker as the verbal IQ, performance IQ discrepancy gets bigger? And anywhere that you see purple indicates a negative correlation. So as the split got bigger, the cortex got thinner in these locations. So if you look at the upper left picture where it says anterior, you see these frontal portions, the prefrontal cortices, are thinner as the verbal spatial discrepancy is bigger. And you see a similar pattern in the back of the brain. And we saw this actually across 2 samples, and we published this in the Journal of Neuroscience. And these are typically developing people ranging in age from 6 to about 60. So that was encouraging to us, that there is a neural substrate or a brain underpinning to this verbal spatial discrepancy. And we also were interested, in the next slide, I'll show you some of our recent work looking at how the verbal spatial discrepancy is associated with executive functioning. And we were interested in this because executive functioning is implicated in the disorders I mentioned earlier of autism, language disorder, reading disorder, and NVLD. So all of those disorders are known to have associated executive functioning problems. And so we wondered if executive function might change with the size of the discrepancy. And so in this experiment, we had children and adolescents lie in the MRI machine and perform a task. And the instructions are to press the button that indicates the direction the arrow is facing. So you can see in this top box where the arrow is facing to the right and it's on the right side of the screen, this would be easy because your brain is processing information in the right visual field and the arrow is facing to the right. So you press the right button. That's called a congruent trial. Below, you see an incongruent trial. Here we have a left-facing arrow on the right side of the screen. So your brain is processing something on the right and you want to press right, but you have to put on the brakes, activate inhibitory control, which is an executive function, and press the left button because the direction of the arrow is left. And here's what we found. On the left side of the screen, you see a brain with lots of red blobs, and this shows activation during resolution of conflict, meaning these are the brain regions that were active while people were resolving the conflict or putting on the brakes to press left, even though the arrow appeared on the right. And what's important to appreciate from this picture is that all the parts of the brain that we think are involved in that network indeed were active. The inferior frontal gyrus, which is the IFG, you see the initials there, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the inferior parietal lobule. We don't need to dwell on these brain parts. What's important is that across these 55, typically developing children and adolescents, everybody was activating this brain network as expected in order to put on the brakes and use their executive functions. When we correlated that brain activity with the size of the split, on the right side of the screen, you see blue blobs indicating an inverse relationship, showing that in individuals with larger verbal spatial splits, there was less activity in the brain where there are blue blobs. And what's important to appreciate here is the blue IFG. So we know that typically people use this IFG to put on the brakes. And in this case, individuals with bigger verbal spatial discrepancies use this part of their brain less when attempting to solve this task. And that is a forthcoming paper in developmental science. So if we just shift now back to nonverbal learning disability, we know the hallmark feature, or the necessary but not sufficient feature, is that verbal is better than spatial ability. And we know about the verbal spatial discrepancy now that it's often measured by differences between verbal and spatial IQ scores, and that these differences between verbal and spatial IQ scores seem to be deriving from a neurobiological substrate, and that is apparent in typically developing individuals. So what else do we know about NVLD? We know there are other weaknesses associated with it. For example, children often who have a diagnosis of NVLD have deficits in, actually I could put that another way, that when assessing for NVLD, clinicians generally look for difficulties in these other areas. Deficits in fine and gross motor skills, difficulty with sensory processing, difficulty with attention, particularly inattention, and executive functions. Children often report levels of anxiety. Occasionally, these children have or are described as having deficits in pragmatic language, which is nuanced language, understanding idiom and metaphor, or the social aspect of language, tone, etc., and sarcasm. Last, these children are often have difficulty with social interactions and working with peers, and trouble with math. So for something to be a disorder, it has to yield impairment. So some of the impairments that people with NVLD often report are problems with peer relationships and interactions, problems working in groups, problems with math, such as generating new strategies for approaching a task, remembering sequences, identifying geometric shapes, lining up numbers on a page, and problems with writing essays, for example, trouble developing topic sentences. Also, NVLD has a number of common comorbidities that people talk about. For example, common comorbidities are disorders that often co-occur with NVLD. For example, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety disorder, and developmental coordination disorder, which is characterized by motor deficits in early childhood and childhood. Now, a student can have all of these disorders with or without NVLD. However, if a child has these disorders and a spatial deficit is present, then NVLD should be considered. And it's important that we think about NVLD so that we can get early diagnosis. Why is early diagnosis important? Well, it's always most beneficial so that intervention can begin as soon as possible. This will provide access to educational and psychological interventions, such as psychotherapy, language, occupational, or physical therapy, participation in social groups, etc. Also, early diagnosis can lead to access to accommodations in school, and I'm going to talk a lot about these at the end of the slideshow, and access to a special education setting if needed. So here I'm going to review some possible signs of NVLD that we have developed in our work at the NVLD Project, which sponsors a lot of my research here at Columbia, and you can see some of these, I think, on that website too, but you have my slides. In early childhood, we think that some signs to look for, children may avoid puzzles and toys like Legos, as I spoke of before. They might have trouble learning the names of shapes. They may have trouble learning commonplace sequences like the days of the week or the months of the year, and trouble learning to tie their shoes, use scissors, hold a pen or pencil, crayon. Also, they may have trouble understanding where to put their body in space, and they may stand too close to someone, or they may choose to sit too far outside of a circle at meeting time. In early elementary school, these children may have trouble learning to tell time, learning the values of coins, learning math concepts such as greater, less than, or names of geometric shapes. And then later in 3rd and 4th grade, these children may begin to have trouble with reading comprehension, specifically identifying the main idea. And importantly, these children are typically not detected as having trouble with reading in 1st and 2nd grade when the emphasis is on learning to decode and learning how to read individual words. But when the focus shifts from learning to read to reading to learn, then these children's difficulties do start to emerge, and their difficulty tends to be around understanding the big picture or the main idea. In later elementary school, children may have trouble reading graphs and charts, grasping cause and effect, learning math concepts such as fractions, and procedures like long division. And then in reading comprehension, they may continue to have this trouble with main idea, and then also more complex questions like author tone and interpreting idioms and metaphors. So why is NVLD overlooked? Well, we think it's a misunderstood syndrome for a number of reasons. First of all, these kids are highly verbal. And so in class, they seem very typical. And this is also not an obvious learning problem like a reading disability. It doesn't emerge in 1st grade. Wow, this child can't spell his own name and can't read the instructions on the board like the other children can. Also, the difficulties these children have shade into mental health problems and attention problems, which leads to NVLD being overlooked. And last, perhaps one of our biggest problems is that it's not in the DSM-5 and it lacks a clear definition. And this means that when NVLD co-occurs with a number of other disorders that are in the DSM-5, often those features of a child's presentation get a diagnosis, and the NVLD part may be overlooked. So children will get a diagnosis that describes some of their problems, like inattention, but the spatial part is overlooked. And nonetheless, as I've shown you, spatial deficits are related to something in the brain, and they do exist in children, and they do cause impairment in life skills, and they need treatment. So as we shift now and think about how do we differentiate NVLD from these other disorders that do get diagnosed because they're in the DSM, here are some things that I think are important ways of distinguishing NVLD from ADHD. First of all, students with NVLD have deficits in spatial reasoning, and those with ADHD do not. And this deficit can lead to impairment in understanding spatial boundaries, processing social cues, finding one's way, etc. And those tend not to be problems that children with ADHD have. Second, students with ADHD may miss details in class because their attention is distracted, but often they can recount the gist of what they hear. They get the main idea. They understand the big picture. And the presentation for children with NVLD is the opposite. Students with NVLD can recount the details, but they don't understand the gist of what they hear. They have trouble relating the main idea. And last, students with NVLD have trouble with novel problem solving. And in fact, children with ADHD are often referred to as quite creative and good at thinking outside the box. So I'm going to shift now and talk about suggestions for teachers that, of course, parents can adapt for using at home when they're helping their children with homework. First, teachers need to try to help students rely on their verbal strengths. So you need to try and take any task that has a spatial component and make it more verbal by talking explicitly about the spatial component. Content that relies on diagrams like a chart or a graph to convey information needs to be discussed explicitly. You need to say to a child, do you see this graph? Here's one bar showing how many cartons of milk a family bought in a family with 8 children, and here's a picture showing how many cartons of milk a family with 3 children bought. And you need to explicitly show the child that this bar is higher than this one. This bar means they bought more milk, and show how the y-axis explains the number of cartons of milk that would be bought. And you need to really explain every part of the picture. And whenever possible, use the student's verbal strength to support their spatial weakness by using vocabulary to build this conceptual knowledge. So as you're explaining this chart, you can draw on the large vocabulary this child has and connect those vocabulary words they know to the spatial visual aspects of this picture. Teachers also need to be explicit about the big picture. That's a hallmark sort of associated problem that children with NVLD have, is it's often said they just miss the big picture. And so in class, teachers need to try to adopt a whole to parts to whole strategy. So they need to establish the overview, which is the big picture, then link new information that's being taught to prior knowledge that the child has. and then work those details back and explicitly connect them to the major concept. Also, if you think about how to apply this to different areas where these children may have trouble in school, one area is outlining, essay writing. And so when teachers are instructing students in how to make an outline for an essay, they need to think about this whole to part to whole strategy. And especially when using graphic organizers, which are these computer software that help students organize their thoughts for an essay, those are visual. And these students really need a lot of direct explanation of how to use the graphic organizer. And they can also use a lot of help with model paragraphs and essays where they will identify key components of the structure of a paragraph and then have practice using it. So in other words, students need to know that the topic sentence of a paragraph is the whole, and then the supporting evidence underneath is the part, and they need to wrap it back to the whole with a concluding sentence for that paragraph. And last, it will help students to develop metacognition. So we often, when we're working with students, have them ask themselves, what do you notice about this problem? What kind of problem is it? And then what strategy should you use? So in other words, these are children who look at a problem and don't recognize, aren't able to figure out what larger category of problem this fits in, and so they don't know what strategy to use, particularly in math if they're asked to do a number of different kinds of problems mixed together on a test. And so this strategy of having the student identify the kind of problem, oh, this is a fractions with different denominators. And then, oh, I use my strategy for forming common denominators, right? And the student needs to use their verbal strength to label the math problem. And then that will allow them to begin accessing and retrieving the information they have about how to solve the problem. Teachers also need to make learning experiential. Using 3D representation of math concepts wherever possible will reduce the visual working memory load. And that's an area of deficit for these kids, visual working memory. They need to use manipulatives like Cuisenaire rods when teaching spatial concepts, or a globe. So instead of teaching a child about a map from a two-dimensional map, if they can use a globe, it will really help them touch it, move it, and understand how things relate to each other. I also think it's very important for these students to practice multiple ways of accessing information. So for example, they may review vocabulary words for a quiz by first defining the word, but when they go to the test, the teacher may actually give them the definition and ask them to produce the word. So students need to practice accessing material from both directions. And when learning a foreign language is always a great example. So you learn you learn the words from English to French. You learn how do you say cat in French? You say chat. How do you say dog? You say chien. And then the child gets to the test and the teacher says, what is a chien? And they've never practiced going from French to English. So students need to be encouraged to practice applying their knowledge, accessing their knowledge in multiple ways, and even applying it in multiple ways, so that they're really prepared for the different ways they can be asked questions about the knowledge they have. That will really help these students who have trouble with the big picture. So in terms of classroom support, in the classroom, the kind of support these children need, and when teachers are going to advocate for their children and say, well, I think my kid could really benefit if the teacher would do X, Y, or Z. Here are some things that teachers could do. For their difficulty handling novelty, these children really need scaffolding. They need modeling, and they need practice. So they really need sample problems, and they need to be given support as they learn to apply the strategy to a sample problem. That's scaffolding, and they need to model. They need to watch someone else do it and learn how to do it. In terms of organization, they need help breaking tasks down into their component parts. In terms of executive functions, students need explicit instruction in how to use a strategy. They can't just be told, well, try using that strategy you used before on this set of problems here. They actually need to be shown how to apply the strategy, or they need to be walked through and shown a sample problem. They also need sample problems on their homework to remind them how to apply a strategy. So sending them home with a page of math that you've reviewed in class that day is fine, but they do need a sample at the top that shows how to work through the problem. And last, they need a repertoire of approaches to a problem. So children often get stuck, and that reflects their difficulty shifting between sets of information or approaches to a problem. And they really need help thinking about, okay, if this didn't work, what can I try next? Sometimes I talk about fractions, and students will look at a math problem and be confused when they don't recognize the problem because teacher taught the adding fractions in a horizontal fashion, and now it's in a vertical fashion, and they need to really look at this problem and try to shift their way of thinking and see if they can identify a strategy to use. And then in terms of attention, and this overlaps a lot with the needs of our ADHD kids, they need to be told specifically what to attend to across all academic tasks. These are children who really have trouble knowing which detail to focus on. And also they need direct instruction in looking for attention errors. So if you say to a student, check your work, that's not really good enough. These students need to be told, check for addition errors, check for subtraction errors, check that you didn't mistakenly do subtraction when the problem was addition. And when checking an essay, for example, they shouldn't be told, oh, go proofread your essay. They need to be told, can you check that you put a period at the end of sentence? Can you check every sentence begins with a capital letter? Can you check you always have a comma before you use a quotation mark? Things like that. And checklists for this are really helpful for these students just to keep inside their notebook so that when someone says, check this over, they can look at their checklist for how to check. Also, these students have trouble with inference. So because of their pragmatic language weaknesses, it's very unlikely that they will know what's expected of them if it's implied. And so these students need explicit instruction in what's expected and what's expected on an assignment. And then in terms of social support, we've had success working with teachers and helping them apply these things in classrooms and in other settings to support students with these NVLD type social problems. So for example, these students need direct instruction in different kinds of friendships and relationships. They also need in-the-moment support in social nuance. So they need direct instruction on the way to understand what's happening when something new arises. And this is often best accomplished when students are involved in supervised group experiences. So for example, special interest groups, after school activities. And if there's an adult present who has some experience with this, they can intervene in this in-the-moment support to really help these children develop their understanding of the social nuance, and that way they can make social connections and activities related to a particular interest and at the same time develop these more nuanced social skills that can be really helpful. So in terms of accommodations, these are things that students might need: preferential seating, like seating up front and away from distractions, same as children with NVLD. They may also need explicit study guides telling them the types of problems that they will be tested on. So in addition to knowing the content, you're going to have to study fractions for this math test. They need to know the kinds of problems. You're going to be asked to add fractions with similar and different denominators. You're going to have to multiply fractions like that. On a history test, you're going to have to write some essays and interpret some pictures and do some short answers, right? So they need to know the kinds of questions to prepare for. They also need sample problems and reminders. They need instructions explained, and they may need modified test questions. This is a nice example of some work we've done for some students at a particular school district where some students with NVLD needed modified test questions. So this particular student needed to, the goal was to reduce the motor demands and working memory demands for this student. The test required the integration of motor and visual spatial skills. And so in this math test, this child was really suffering, and the school came to us and said, can you help us separate out or rewrite this test so that we can see if the child has learned what we're teaching and not just test the disability. So for the first example, which most of the kids in the class could do easily, was solve the riddle. I am a quadrangle. I have two pairs of parallel sides. All of my angles are right angles. I am not a square. But for the child with NVLD, this problem is going to greatly tax their visual working memory and their novel problem solving and be very difficult. So instead, we drew a picture of the rectangle and we had the child say, how many parallel sides are there? What are the types of angles? And name this quadrangle. So the teacher could see that the child understood all the properties of a rectangle and could identify it. But by removing the novelty of a riddle and the working memory piece of the way the riddle was structured, the child could demonstrate his knowledge. Similarly, in the bottom example, the teacher was testing whether students understood the concept of a line of reflection. And in this test, the students were supposed to draw the figure that's in red below the line of reflection to indicate they understood what that meant. So we modified it. Now the slide doesn't show it exactly right. The line down, the vertical line between the two triangles is what the student was expected to draw. So the instruction was, give the student both images and have them draw the line of reflection between the two triangles. So that way the student didn't have to draw a complicated design, taxing their visual motor integration skills, and instead could draw a single line and still show that he understood line of reflection. I'm getting to the end here, just going to wrap up talking about accommodations for these students on standardized tests and in school. So given their deficits in attention and executive functioning that result in unequal access to standardized tests and in-class assignments, students require 50% extended time on all tests, etc. And that really does need to be backed up by a complex evaluation showing how attention and executive functioning deficits are creating unequal access. For example, the student can't focus, is distracted, needs time to deploy strategies, needs time to check their work, gets stuck, and needs to have time to deploy a strategy to shift. And all that can be shown, then a student can have extra time. Given students difficulty with novelty, they should be allowed to take these high stakes exams at their home school, with which they're familiar. So making this child go to an unfamiliar school on the day of a high-stakes exam will just heighten their anxiety and interfere with their ability to demonstrate their capacities. Given students' distractibility, testing should be provided in a separate location to minimize distractions. And given their motor deficits, they should be allowed to keyboard or dictate responses or use speech-to-text software. And these students need copies of class notes in advance of class so they can write notes directly onto the teacher's outline. So as I conclude, I think, what I want to say is nonverbal learning disability is a putative neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by a deficit in spatial reasoning that can result in impairment in social or academic activities, I should say psychological too, and that individuals with nonverbal learning disability benefit from specific support and intervention like those described here.
Okay. We are ready to take some questions. Many of the questions relate to diagnosis. For example, 3 or 4 people have asked, can a child have both ADHD and NVLD? Is it always one or the other, or is it possible to have both at the same time?
Right. So it's absolutely possible to have both. And that's what we mean by common comorbidities. So a child could have a diagnosis of NVLD, and we know that attention problems are part of the NVLD syndrome, correct? But if those problems in attention rise to the level of a diagnosable condition, then the child would have both diagnoses. Right, and we diagnose ADHD based on the presence of a clinically significant number and degree of symptoms of either inattentive or hyperactive impulsive type symptoms, right? So it could be that a child meets criteria for everything about nonverbal learning disability, and also the attention executive function problems that the child has are clinically significant, and so we would diagnose both. Okay. And following from that, those children likely need support for both problems. Right. So, some of the solutions overlap, right? Like the things teachers should do in class for someone with ADHD are often very good for someone with NVLD for the attention aspect of that disorder, and then some of them are different. Okay. And I guess then the corollary question, how do you know if a child only has NVLD and not ADHD, and would ADHD medication still help NVLD given the inattention and working memory issues? Executive function issues. Right. So that is, I think, one of the $1 million questions, right? Right. Are there medical solutions for NVLD? And to date, there haven't been randomized clinical trials looking at whether stimulant medication, like for ADHD, or non-stimulant medication for that matter, that we use for ADHD, would benefit children with NVLD. Now, part of the reason those studies haven't been done is it's very hard to study a disorder that's not clearly defined. Although we are trying to do that here at Columbia, we're currently doing a neuroimaging study of children with NVLD and following accepted criteria for the disorder. But I think that if a child has NVLD and has pretty significant ADHD symptoms that don't, so what you're saying is if a child has NVLD but doesn't meet criteria for ADHD, would medication help those ADHD symptoms? Right. And there is some nice evidence from the NIH, from Philip Shaw's group, showing that individuals who don't have a diagnosis of ADHD, right? But the more symptoms their parents report about them on the ADHD scale, the more their brain starts to look like an ADHD brain. So there is actually evidence of the biological basis of a little bit of ADHD.
Interesting.
And so it's possible. I'm not an MD and I don't prescribe medication, but I do think that you could consult a child psychiatrist about the particular symptoms someone with NVLD, the particular attention symptoms that an NVLD person is displaying, to see if medication could be useful. There isn't really a rule that medication is only useful for symptoms when they meet criteria for ADHD.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think particularly understanding that as people show more and more symptoms, the brain looks more and more ADD or ADHD, suggests that you may have close or subthreshold level of symptoms, and that could respond to medication.
Okay, got it. There are a number of questions relating to a topic that you and I discussed before the webinar started. So people who have said things like, my child has many of these symptoms, but he's great with Legos. Could he still have NVLD?
Right.
Or, someone else here who says, I've long suspected my child had NVLD, but her diagnosis is generalized anxiety disorder. Can a child score average on block tests and spatial reasoning and still have NVLD? So it sounds like NVLD is a difficult diagnosis at some level, and how should parents go? I guess the larger question is how, and that's also been asked, how should people go about seeking a diagnosis?
Right. So I'll take each one of those at a time. I jotted them down. So for the child who's good at Legos, and the parent is wondering, could it still be NVLD? Absolutely. I mean, you can use verbal strategies to mediate Legos, and this child might have very good fine motor skills. And so for the kid who has real difficulty following the Lego instruction booklet and a motor deficit, they're going to shy away from the Legos. But it's possible that, there's no reason to think that just because you could do Legos and jigsaw puzzles means you don't have NVLD. The core feature of NVLD is a spatial deficit, and this speaks to the person with the daughter who has anxiety and is doing average on a block design test. Mm-hmm. I think that a spatial deficit needs to be understood in two ways. It can be a deficit relative to the typical population, meaning below average relative to other people your age, or it can be deficient relative to your own other excellent abilities. So for the child who has average on block design, if everything else in the verbal domain is much higher than average, mm-hmm. that to me could suggest a discrepancy. So it isn't only a deficit, but a discrepancy can also manifest as NVLD.
Okay.
And in fact, in most inclusion criteria for studies and in describing the disorder, we do talk about either it's a spatial deficit or a discrepancy. And so I may have been a little misleading in one of my slides talking about the spatial deficit when we're studying in the brain is the discrepancy. So
it's the gap between the verbal score and the performance. Yeah,
and
right,
so
okay.
So to bring to the third question, how should people get diagnosed? They need to have a really comprehensive neuropsychological assessment that is conducted by someone who can understand these subtle issues and consider them in the totality of the child's whole presentation and really think through, does this seem to fit with what we know about NVLD?
Okay. So it's a neuropsychological evaluation that looks at this gap between spatial abilities and verbal abilities. That is the hallmark, I think. Correct? I
think so, but that's the beginning, right? I mean, a regular psychoed at school would look at verbal spatial discrepancies. So let me say this, that sometimes the spatial problem doesn't emerge on block design, but it emerges on other tests of spatial problem solving that aren't part of the IQ test. Mm-hmm. Now, who knows why? It could be because that person had more experience playing with blocks when they were little, or that particular test makes sense to them. And when you test other aspects of spatial reasoning, the deficit emerges or the discrepancy emerges. So it's not just that you need an IQ test. You really need someone who's going to assess IQ and spatial reasoning and language and verbal reasoning and motor skills and learning and memory, attention and executive function. Those 5 domains of cognition, I could run through them again, is language, visual spatial, learning/memory, attention/executive function, and motor. Those are the 5 domains of cognition that really need to be assessed. And then thinking about strengths and patterns of strengths and weaknesses across those domains and how they relate to academic performance, social functioning, and psychological functioning. So is there anxiety? Are there peer problems? Is there trouble with math? Is there a pragmatic language problem? Then you start to get the picture and can think about whether this is NVLD.
Okay. So it sounds like, for those people who are asking what kind of a professional should they go to, that you're looking at a very good educational psychologist.
I think a
neuropsychologist who does evaluations.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Because in general, educational psychologists, at least in New York, tend to be more research-driven and not clinicians.
Okay. So you're looking for a strong psychologist and psychological evaluation. And of course, I don't need to tell you this, getting that paid for is often a challenge for parents.
Right. Of course.
So, yeah. Another set of questions are coming in involved a relationship.
To that,
yes.
I would say, you can always, all children are entitled to an evaluation at their school. Some people are, find the evaluation at school is quite thorough, and in other settings it's not. But if you're armed with information as a parent who can advocate, you could go in saying, I'm concerned about this NVLD because I think my child shows A, B, C, D things. So when you evaluate him or her, can you look for these things and talk to me about these things?
Interesting. One person,
because those are free.
Right. Kathy just posted, could neuroscience such as decreased coordination, difficulty with pencil grip and tying shoes, and deficits in math, but paired with very strong language skills, potentially reflect NVLD? And I think you'd say yes, right? So that's something she would need to, as you point out, relay to the tester.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
Right, because you're hitting all the hallmarks of all the list of things on our...
Yeah, it sounds like the presentation, right? So another set of questions relate to the relationship between NVLD and dyslexia or dysgraphia. Are those separate? Can they overlap?
Okay. More? Or that's it?
Yeah. Well, there's more, but start there. Yeah.
So I think, first of all, dysgraphia is a disorder of motor where it's characterized by poor handwriting that's difficult to read, right? And actually effortful and laborious handwriting on the part of the child. So they may have hand cramping and pain while they're writing, and their writing is often illegible and hard to read. That's different from dyslexia. So I think having NVLD and dysgraphia are quite commonly co-occurring because dysgraphia is a fine motor problem. And fine motor problems are part of the NVLD syndrome.
Right.
Dyslexia is another problem. Dyslexia, in my world, refers to children who have a particular presentation of trouble with phonological processing and maybe rapid naming, leading to trouble with fluent reading, word decoding, and not language comprehension. So in other words, dyslexia is a particular variant of reading disorder.
Okay.
Right? And it is actually defined in the DSM as trouble with decoding. So it would be 2 separate disorders. I don't think there's a reason that someone could have, there's no reason someone couldn't have both. I don't see them co-occurring often.
Okay, interesting. So the spatial component of NVLD doesn't necessarily relate to reading difficulties necessarily at all. Okay, interesting.
It doesn't rule it in or out.
Okay, separate issue. That's helpful.
I mean, there's also a group of kids who are referred to as visual dyslexics. Now, that's a different story, and that's not in the DSM, and that's another problem. But in general, the dyslexia, I think, the way it's defined in the DSM, it could co-occur with NVLD.
Okay. And then another set of questions relate to the overlap or comorbidity or relationship between autism and autistic spectrum disorders and NVLD.
Right. That's the other $1 million question.
Yeah.
So people often think about that because both disorders are characterized by some social functioning problems, right? That's the commonality between them. And we are working in our research on understanding if NVLD and autism spectrum disorders are discrete from one another, or if NVLD is a subtype of an autism spectrum disorder. And we don't have a definitive answer on that right now, although I do think that, and it's complicated by the change in definition of autism from DSM-4 to DSM-5. So in the past, much research showed that if you had autism, there would be a greater likelihood of having a spatial greater than verbal discrepancy, whereas in NVLD, it's the opposite presentation, right? And in my brain data, we see opposite brain effects depending on the direction of the split. So I didn't show this. I showed the slide depicting the cortical thinning that happens as verbal gets bigger than spatial. But on the flip side of that coin is that as spatial gets higher than verbal, we see cortical thickening in those same regions. And the same was true as the verbal spatial discrepancy gets bigger, we see less activation of the inferior frontal gyrus during executive functioning tasks. And then as spatial gets higher than verbal, we see overactivation.
Okay.
And that's consistent with studies of individuals with autism performing this task who overactivate that region. So there's some, in my mind, reason to think that these are at least disorders on different sides of this verbal spatial discrepancy spectrum, and maybe they're different. I think we need to work hard on how we distinguish. The way I would distinguish would be in the DSM. To have a diagnosis of autism, there are these cluster B symptoms like strict adherence to routine, repetitive motor acts, sensory, hyper sensitive to sensory stimulation. And so we could make a distinction between NVLD and autism spectrum by saying, if you have more than one of those cluster B symptoms, you do not have NVLD. Because none of those things are really characteristic of NVLD as we define it, right? I mean, nobody's, they're not the main feature. We don't expect hyper interest in something or stereotype repetitive movements. Those are not things people talk about with NVLD. Now, the sensory stuff sometimes has come up. But if there was only one, but the social is separate, right? So the social difficulties are cluster A, and then cluster B are these repetitive behaviors and strict adherence to routine, sensitivity to sensory information. So I think that may be a way that we can discriminate between these disorders. But
so
I think
they'll ultimately be distinguished from one another.
Exactly. But what leads people to ask this question, are they similar, is the commonality of their social problems.
Right.
And if you dive deeper there, some people think they can discriminate the kinds of social difficulties that children with autism spectrum disorder have from the kinds of difficulties that children with NVLD have with social interaction. That also remains to be seen, right? We need a much better description of that.
Okay. Sort of running out of time here, very unfortunately. Let me go to a big macro question that a couple of people have asked. Is NVLD treatable? What is the prognosis for adults who have finally learned that they have NVLD? And where do you see kids with NVLD coming out in high school, college, and beyond?
So that's one of the things that we really hope to study here is what does happen. We don't have a lot of data about that, and that would really help us with defining this as a discrete disorder. If you're an adult who just got this diagnosis, I think you should go back to the person who gave you the diagnosis and ask them for advice about treatment. I think that traditional psychotherapy could be helpful, just as it is for these kids, and to try and do some psychoeducation around personal strengths and weaknesses and functional impairments, and try to really focus on how am I going to change these impairments? How can I use my strengths to overcome these difficulties? And I think there is treatment for children that I've tried to talk about here. These children need intervention and treatment in all of these fronts. And where do you get that? Can be in school from a counselor or from a private psychologist or an OT or a PT or speech language person, depending on where the functional impairment is showing up the most.
Okay. And I think what you're saying is with these kinds of help and accommodations, kids can learn, or adults can learn to cope with this disability. And make progress. Absolutely, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So in my personal experience of having worked with and treated and followed these kids, I know a dozen or so who I worked with myself who, are adults and having a jolly time after graduating successfully from college and have jobs and relationships and move on and get married and have families and, struggle like the rest of us do with different problems and different days. Right. But for the most part, have really struggled when I first met them in elementary school, and have learned a lot of strategies to overcome their difficulties.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? Acknowledging what the disorder is, finding it, diagnosing it, and coping with it. Okay. So Thank you so much. This is incredibly interesting. I want to also thank again Winston Prep, educational innovative day school in the New York region, www.winstonprep.edu, and Amy Margolis. Great information. Everyone, don't forget that Dr. Margolis' slides will be on the Attitude website shortly for download, attitudemag.com/webinars. And we hope that you will return for another session on this fascinating topic. We
absolutely
thank everyone and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.